Thank you very much. It's a delight to be here in Hong Kong. On behalf of the UK Fashion and Textile Association and the industry, thank you for hosting us. Thank you to the British Consulate for suggesting us and for creating the relationship which has enabled the UK to be the partner country this year. Also, very great thanks to our friends and colleagues from Messe Frankfurt, Hong Kong, who are in the room. We work very closely with them. It's very nice to see you again. I've been asked to talk very briefly, which is perhaps something that I'm not always very good at doing. Those of you that know me know that I'm not known for my brevity, about the UK worldview on the opportunities and challenges of the fashion and textile industry. And I should start off by saying we live in interesting times. So a little bit of work, a few notes about, and that is very, very large, isn't it, about UKFT, the UK Fashion and Textile Association. It's a private trade association set up by the industry for the industry, and our intention is to bring together the very different parts of this industry. You heard from Chris earlier on about the extent of the industry. We work on fashion, textiles, anything that can be worn on the body, but we also work into areas, for example, such as jewellery, footwear, for example, accessories. So the list goes on. We're the largest network in the UK for fashion and textiles. We're also the most welcoming. We will never look at a collection and say, don't like that, it's not appropriate. We will always find some way in which we can engage. From the very, very smallest one-man band startup designer to the very largest UK international retailers and stores, for example, Burberry, Marks and Spencer. We have most of them in membership of our organisation. And our aim is to provide practical advice, and I really do underline the word practical here. We pride ourselves on the practicality and the accuracy of the information that we give to the industry, but also the connections, the way in which we bring the industry together to make sure that it shares information about best practice, compliance, sustainability, ethical trade. We do a lot of work on compliance, sustainability, transparency and innovation, and you'll hear from me in a moment about that. We also work very much to elevate the skills in the UK manufacturing supply chain, and I'll explain in a moment why that is important. The UK has a very strong heritage-based, niche-based manufacturing industry. Yes, we really do. We're very proud of it. It's very important that it remains because smaller companies, smaller designers starting their collections need access to flexible, ethical, sustainable manufacturing close to shore in order to launch their initial collections. Finally, it's my great privilege, often, and some of you may have seen photographs in the past, of taking our President, Her Royal Highness the Princess Royal, Princess Anne, to most people in this room, to various factories. She is the most extraordinary support to our industry. She has an encyclopedic knowledge of the industry. She knows it better than any of us. From sheep to shelf, the Princess is passionate about this industry and a very, very welcome supporter. A few facts and figures, if I may. From Chris, you've already heard some of those. £62 billion to the UK economy. In real terms, it supports 1 in 25 jobs in the UK if you include retail and all the other parts of the supply chain. So very, very important. Lots and lots of people around the country bringing ideas to life. It's one of the largest sectors in the UK, probably bigger than the automotive industry, although it doesn't always get the same level of focus that we would always like from a government point of view. Nonetheless, it is a very important employer. 140,000, that doesn't sound like an awful lot when you're in this part of the world, but it is. Employing people across the northern parts of the UK, Yorkshire in particular, known for its textiles, Humberside, Northern Ireland, Wales, a much smaller industry but still very important, and into the southwest of the UK, for example, which was where traditionally we used to raise most of our sheep and where most of the UK's wool traditionally tended to come from. UK manufacturing is critical for those smaller brands starting out. Not everybody can meet the massive production numbers required for countries like China, for example, to manufacture their goods. So it's really important that we continue to encourage and support UK heritage textiles, even if often the heritage textiles and the fabrics and the fashion that we sell is often perhaps better known in Asia and United States than it is sometimes closer to home in the UK. If you stop the average person in the street in Japan and ask them who Nigel Cabourn and Margaret Howell are, they will know the answer to that. If you stop the average person in Birmingham, they might not. Compliance and sustainability are a major, major challenge for the fashion and textile industry. That is not unique to the UK in any way. But I thought I might just set out briefly some of the context of why it's important. So you've already heard from Chris about the UK's commitment to net zero. That's a very real commitment. The UK industry is moving very fast in that direction. We're very much keen to protect the UK manufacturing base. I've already said it before. European compliance has been galloping ahead of the UK for some time, and we're already seeing signs that countries like the United States are also beginning to really look in great depth at the products that are made, that are shipped into that country, to make sure that they meet the rules on dyes, for example, on ethical production, and other elements that are really key. So companies, and you'll be hearing from UK designers later who will be looking to see what the UK and the EU legislation says, and they will be meeting those targets. But the UK designer industry, London Fashion Week, for example, most of the designers are committed to driving the standards well beyond the minimum levels required by government. And I think that's an important issue for us all to bear in mind, because consumers expect this industry to be clean, to be sustainable, to be ethical. And they don't want to pay, and this is the challenge, they don't want to pay anything extra for that. They expect it as part of the deal. The UK's Modern Slavery Act, for example, looks very closely at not just where goods are made, but who made them. In the United States, we're beginning to see that at a federal level, the US government will reject goods that it believes have been made in parts of the world where they believe that slavery is said to exist. The EU, certain countries, particularly Germany, but the rest of the EU is also moving in that direction. At the same time, we see that there is massive protectionism. So on the back of compliance and a commitment to sustainable fashion and textiles, you see greater protectionism coming through. The UK, and I often tease our government about this, the UK government sees itself, if you like, as the last bastion of free trade in the world. But the rest of the world, the European Union, the United States, and other commercial partners are increasingly protectionist, are increasingly raising the standards to levels where international competition cannot always get in. We need to understand that. We need to be ready to address that challenge. So some of the work that we do for UKFT's members around compliance, we have a two-member team of that group. It's a new team explaining to UK companies what the EU rules say and how they are interpreted. And I'll put some of those up for you later on. Compliance is very much around the standards and regulations that already exist and what is required as a minimum standard. But we also have, and you'll see in a moment, a sustainability team that look at how do we go beyond that? How do we make the industry cleaner? We engage with the UK government on a regular basis to make sure that the UK policy and regulatory environment is in step with where the industry needs to go. Politically, sometimes this is slightly complicated. International buyers tend to use the EU as the industry standard. So whilst the UK brands and designers will always look to the UK standard, we're also unpicking and explaining and unpacking the EU legislation, because that in some ways for this industry is more important than the UK rules, particularly for those of us that are involved in the export side of the business. A lot of advocacy where we feed in ideas from a UK perspective into the EU Commission. For example, some of you may have heard of the Product Environmental Footprint, or PEF. This is a very troublesome development, if you like, in some ways, where consumers are being given what we believe to be rather misleading information that suggests that man-made fibres could have a better environmental footprint than natural fibres, which can more easily be upcycled, recycled, and passed on. So quite some interesting conversations there. And all of these views and conversations are based very much on the feedback from our members, designers, manufacturers and retailers. We're also a member of most of the key standards bodies, for example, the British Standards Institutes. Some of the things that we do here, I'm not going to go through the whole list, but product labelling and fibre composition, EU general product safety regulations, UK product safety reforms, for example, looking very much at the Green Claims Directive in the UK, which basically says if you say that something is sustainable, how do you prove on paper? Bear in mind that British civil servants can be incredibly pedantic on this issue. How do you prove to a government department that your green claim is really true? If you can't, the law says you cannot make that claim. REACH, both UK and EU REACH, so looking at the dyes that are used in the manufacturing of garments. And it's often worth saying that the textile industry in the UK has always kept its head quite low when we talk about sustainability and environmental impacts, but actually the majority of the more dangerous parts of producing a garment go into the production of the fabric. So how do we make sure that the textile that we use is the best that we can possibly use? We also look at different sectors, fashion, homes, fashion, footwear, homeware and suppliers, toys, PPE, eyewear. All of these industries have different rules and they are part of our industry. Just to give you a little bit of a map there, you've got all of these product regulations. For example, I mentioned GPSR earlier on. You've got eco-design rules, for example, the unsold goods rules, for example. Certain countries, in particular France, for example, have specific laws that say that you cannot pulp or destroy certain garments. Once they've been made, they have to be recycled or used in different ways. Ethical compliance is a massive thing for our industry. So the UK's modern slavery I've mentioned, but the US is also working on its own. Green claims, the list goes on. This is just a very small snapshot of what's coming out of the EU, and the UK is not that far behind. Sustainability, on the other hand, is what the industry can do to make itself greener, more ethical, more sustainable, cleaner and better. And this is something that we're very, very committed to at UKFT. I mentioned the greenwashing earlier on. There's a real push in the UK to make sure that green claims are real, that they can be backed up, that they really mean something. And a lot of this is not just driven by government in the UK. It's often driven by consumers around the world who are increasingly following our advice to read the label, to think about where things are made, who made them, the conditions in which they were made. And it's a matter of personal pride that the UK has been at a number of these international sustainability groups. We have very good friends, for example, who created the Fashion Revolution, a group of UK designers who came together in London to create an organisation that looks at making sure that the UK and the international fashion and textile industry become more sustainable, greener and better. What is the cost? What are the challenges? Well, the biggest cost I've already mentioned is consumers don't want to have to pay extra for this. I don't know how we solve this. How do we bridge this gap? Because I spend a lot of my time at events, perhaps a little bit like this one, where the industry is talking to itself and saying, we need to be greener, we need to be better, we need to be cleaner, we need to be more sustainable. But actually the conversations often need to take place outside this building. We need to go into consumers at Lane Crawford, for example. We need to be engaging with consumers to make sure that they understand the actions, that the effects of their consumer spend. In the UK, we have skills shortages, for example. It's more difficult to find qualified labour in the UK. The massive regulatory burden that we're seeing across the industry is really, really strong. The UK has a minimum wage of £12.50 an hour. you can imagine if you compare that with £7.50 an hour in Portugal, £3.50 an hour in Bulgaria, far less when you come into certain parts of Asia, for example. I think I checked the figures in India and it's £1.40 an hour. It becomes very difficult to be competitive in that environment and to keep your skills. The other issue is that there are additional data costs for companies to keep all of this information, which governments are increasingly asking them to hold. So we're generally used to being business people where we produce something and we sell it. But now businesses are being asked to be data controllers and police themselves in areas that perhaps are not naturally those that business is very good at doing. So I just thought I'd flash that one up there just to give you an idea of some of the areas. A few buzzwords that just give us pleasure. We talk a lot in the UK about pollution. We talk a lot about green infrastructure, plastic pollution in our seas, for example, zero waste commitments from the UK, the carbon footprint, very importantly. So you can manufacture things greenly, if that's an adverb. But it's always very difficult to get them back to wherever the consumer is based without using a lot of fossil fuels. And UK businesses are increasingly looking at their carbon footprint, not just from a point of view of manufacturing, but also from the supply chain point of view. You know, the shipping of the goods can be sometimes much more dirty and much more polluting than actually the production of the goods themselves. I'll close talking briefly about some of the work that we do at UKFT to help UK companies to sell around the world, because having encouraged them to make the goods, we then have to try and help them to sell the goods. They're not going to manufacture goods if they can't actually sell them. And the UK has a really good reputation as a cutting-edge designer. London Fashion Week, for example, is the jewel in the crown as far as we're all concerned in the UK. But also the promotion of quality, creative and innovative products, which the UK is rightly known for. So we take companies on a fashion business point of view, on a journey. We help them to understand business to business to consumer, direct to consumer strategies. Pricing is really important for young, small British businesses to understand, because they often end up cannibalizing their wholesale business to promote their direct-to-consumer business, for example. Price points are, the internet makes it possible for consumers to see how much something costs anywhere in the world, across multiple platforms. More recently, and you can see I have grey hair, we've been subject to the constant whims and changes of tariff policy coming out of the United States. The UK is not unique in that by any means. We have a reasonably good deal with the United States at the moment on that basis, which we're pleased to see. But the world is changing and moving very quickly. We look very much at which markets are likely to be more receptive to UK manufactured and or designed products. Japan, for example, is a big one for most of the designer businesses that I work with. But we also take cocktail and evening wear to the United States and to the Middle East, for example. Knitwear, very big in certain parts of Europe. Again, Asia, Japan, and the United States. Looking at the various challenges between wholesale markets and working with agents, distributors, and marketplaces, for example, there are legal protections for agents in Europe, including the UK, that brands need to be aware of. So you can't just switch them off. They have rights, even if they're not written into the contract. Accessing government information and support, which is usually non-financial where it is available, but the UK has some very good support, for example, at the consulate here in Hong Kong, in Japan, in various other markets. We also help them with their global logistics, because increasingly companies are having to look at a multiple approach to their different logistical challenges to get goods made in the right place and sold in the right way and most efficiently to consumers. A few key events that we work on for fashion. So Paris Men's Fashion Week, Paris Women's Fashion Week, Paris Lingerie and Swim Weeks are big events for the UK. The UK is probably the third largest group in Paris after France and Italy. Italy is always the one to beat for us in this industry. Pitti Uomo in Florence, the world's largest and most prestigious menswear show, but we also go to Chicago Collective, Playtime Children's Wear in Paris, Who's Next and the Salon de la Lingerie, White Milan, for example, a very good show, Milan Fashion Week, one of my favorites, some of the Berlin and Dusseldorf more regional shows, which are very important. Germany is probably one of our largest export markets within the EU. The US being very important, also New York Fashion Coterie and designers and agents. On the textile side, Milan Unica is probably the lead menswear show for us at the moment for textiles. We also work with Premier Vision. Very importantly for us, and particularly for this part of the world, we have an amazing relationship with the Messe Frankfurt team here. We come regularly to Intertextile Shanghai, which we've been doing now for the last 10 or so years. Also more recently branched out into Viet in Vietnam, which is working very well for UK heritage textile companies that want to sell into the Asian market. And next week, I'll be doing a research project to South Korea. We regularly travel to Japan, and we're also going back to Vietnam with support from our British Consulate General in Ho Chi Minh. So just some closing thoughts on challenges. The world is changing. Consumers are changing. Protectionism, I've said already, is on the rise. Household incomes are falling in traditional markets. So the situation where the East supplies and the West buys is a myth that we all need to recognize as a myth and need to move on from. Rising cost of production around the world, not just in Europe, are here to stay. Falling disposable income rates are very important, particularly in the West. Lack of new markets for Western companies because we can't sell to Russia at the moment, for example. China is more difficult as a market for many of us. So the new routes to market are more difficult. There's also the homogenization and the trivialization of fashion, by which I mean that designers spend most of their time and put their lives and businesses on the line to create new collections, but often those collections are being used in ways which don't always get them a buyer. So, for example, taking part in a catwalk show doesn't actually sell any collections. How does the designer manage to afford to pay the cost of working on a catwalk collection unless he or she or they can actually find a route to market from that? So I mentioned the changing role of fashion weeks. Very importantly, supply chain fragility and scarcer resources. There's a big move towards safe shoring at the moment in our industry. Safe shoring used to mean looking at those parts of the world where your supply chain was solid, where there were no wars going on. But increasingly over the last year, it's also started to look at, well, are we selling to countries where, for example, there may be a dramatic change in tariffs? We keep on coming back to tariffs. So uncertainty, instability, and challenges are probably here to stay. That's it from me. Thank you very much.